December 12th, 1941, Leningrad, Soviet Union. A Red Army engineer named Dmitry Pavlov stands in a makeshift warehouse on the Nevsky Prospect, staring at what remains of the city's food reserves. He holds a clipboard with calculations that won't balance. The numbers mock him. His pencil hovers over the page, trembling slightly from the cold, from exhaustion, from the mathematics of death itself. The warehouse stretches before him, cavernous and nearly empty. Where mountains of grain once stood, he sees scattered sacks. Where barrels of flour filled entire rooms, he counts individual containers. The inventory takes minutes when it should take hours. Pavlov does the calculation again. 3 million people. Current reserves, daily requirements. The numbers yield the same brutal answer. At current ration levels, the city has 10 days of food remaining. 10 days before systematic starvation replaces mere hunger. 10 days before Leningrad citizens begin eating things that were never meant to be eaten. He looks down at his ration card, stamped and creased from constant handling. Tomorrow, he'll authorize another reduction. Tomorrow, the daily bread ration will drop to 125 grams for civilians, less than 3 slices. Tomorrow, that bread will contain more sawdust than flour, more cellulose than grain. Pavlov doesn't know that the winter ahead will claim 100,000 lives per month. He doesn't know that desperate citizens will boil leather belts, scrape wallpaper paste from apartment walls, and consume joiner's glue made from animal bones. He doesn't know that the city he's trying to save will endure 872 days of siege, becoming the deadliest blockade in human history. But what he discovers in the months ahead about human endurance, about survival beyond all biological logic, would redefine what military planners thought possible. For 3 months, German Army Group North had been tightening the noose around Leningrad. On September 8, 1941, Wehrmacht forces completed their encirclement of the city, cutting the last land route to the Soviet interior. The siege that followed was no accident. It was deliberate policy. Adolf Hitler's directive was explicit. Leningrad was to be erased from existence. The Führer has decided to wipe the city of Petersburg from the face of the earth, read the German High Command's September 29th order. The strategy was starvation. German artillery would pound the city. The Luftwaffe would bomb supply depots and food warehouses. But the real weapon was hunger. Leningrad held immense strategic and symbolic value. The city was home to the Baltic Fleet, crucial industrial facilities, and a civilian population of 3.2 million. More importantly, it was the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, the former imperial capital renamed for Lenin himself. Its capture would deliver a devastating psychological blow to Soviet resistance. The Germans understood urban warfare's cost. Stalingrad would later prove that calculation correct. Instead of street-by-street fighting, Wehrmacht commanders chose patience. Let winter and famine do the work. Let the city consume itself from within. The statistics backed up the terror. On September 8th, German incendiary bombs destroyed the Badaev warehouses, Leningrad's largest food depot. 3,000 tons of flour burned. 700 tons of sugar melted into the earth, creating pools of sweetness that desperate citizens would later dig up and sell. The acrid smell of burning food hung over the city for days, a cruel mockery of what was to come. By November 1941, the situation had deteriorated beyond worst-case projections. Dmitry Pavlov, the city's supply chief, ordered the 5th reduction in rations since the siege began. Workers in essential industries received 250 grams of bread daily. Everyone else, clerks, children, the elderly, received half that amount, 125 grams, 4.4 ounces. Less than a thick slice of bread, and half of it wasn't bread at all. Food scientists worked desperately to extend what little remained. The official bread recipe became a nightmare catalog of substitutes. 50% rye flour when available, often replaced by flour made from sweepings from the warehouse floors. 10% cottonseed cake, normally used for cattle feed. 10% cellulose derived from pine sawdust. And various fillers, including wallpaper paste, leather dust, and ground-up sheep guts. Tatiana Grigorieva, a baker who worked through the siege, later described the bread. It was black, it was heavy, and it tasted of bitterness and mildew. But we guarded those ovens like they held gold. Because they did. The city's infrastructure began failing in tandem with its food supplies. Water pipes froze and burst. Electricity became intermittent, then non-existent for most districts. Public transportation stopped. The iconic Leningrad trams sat frozen in their tracks, soon to be stripped for parts and fuel. Most devastating was the cold. The winter of 1941 to 42 descended with particular cruelty. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees. In unheated apartments, people burned furniture, then floorboards, then books. When nothing remained to burn, families huddled together under every piece of clothing they owned, conserving warmth as carefully as calories. The human body requires approximately 2,000 calories daily to maintain basic functions. Leningrad's siege rations provided fewer than 500. The city's population began a slow-motion death march, bodies consuming themselves from within, burning muscle and organ tissue to fuel one more day, one more hour. What made the Leningrad siege unique in modern warfare was its duration and its totality. This wasn't a short-term emergency where deprivation would end in weeks. This was systematic, weaponized starvation extending across seasons, across years. And in that crucible, ordinary citizens would resort to survival methods that military science had never documented. The question facing Pavlov and every person trapped in Leningrad wasn't whether they would suffer. It was whether any conceivable adaptation could allow human beings to survive on virtually nothing for months on end. German commanders watched Leningrad through binoculars from their positions south of the city, confident that time favored them. Wehrmacht intelligence estimated the city's food reserves couldn't sustain the population beyond mid-November. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leip, commander of Army Group North, told his staff in October, "The city will be ours by Christmas without firing another shot. Hunger is our most reliable ally." German psychological warfare units dropped leaflets over Leningrad depicting steaming bowls of soup and fresh bread. The message was simple: surrender, and you will be fed. Hitler's generals assumed that mass starvation would break Soviet morale, that desperate civilians would open the gates from within, that Leningrad would collapse like a house built on sand. They couldn't have known how wrong they were. What the Wehrmacht failed to understand was that Leningrad's citizens weren't fighting for ideology alone. They were fighting for survival with a resourcefulness born of absolute desperation. Every calculation, every assumption about human endurance would prove inadequate. Inside the city, the first wave of deaths came quickly. The elderly succumbed first, their bodies unable to function on subsistence rations. Then, the very young. By December, Leningrad's hospitals were overflowing with dystrophy cases, the medical term for advanced starvation. Doctors watched helplessly as patients' bodies consumed themselves, organs shutting down one by one. The city's morgues couldn't handle the volume. Bodies lay in the streets, frozen solid, waiting for spring thaws that would create new horrors. Dmitry Lazarev, a NKVD officer, wrote in his diary, "I counted 43 bodies on my walk to headquarters this morning. Tomorrow there will be more. We have stopped counting." Conventional military wisdom held that a surrounded city would capitulate when food stores dropped below a certain threshold. But Leningrad's defenders found sustenance in places no quartermaster had ever cataloged. Engineers identified every possible source of calories, no matter how unconventional. Chemists analyzed everything. Leather from furniture and belts contained protein and fats if boiled long enough. Wallpaper paste made before 1930 was manufactured from flour and potato starch. Joiner's glue, the kind used in woodworking, was made from boiled animal bones and hooves, essentially pure collagen. Even petroleum jelly from the city's chemical plants could theoretically provide calories, though it caused violent digestive distress. Scientists at the Leningrad Institute of Nutrition worked around the clock, testing substances. Professor Andrei Bezubov's team published daily bulletins. Citizens should boil leather goods for 6 to 8 hours. The resulting broth can be consumed. Carpenter's glue can be softened and boiled to create a jelly-like substance. The advice sounded insane. It was also technically accurate. Gelatin, derived from animal collagen, contains amino acids the body can metabolize. A 100-gram portion of reconstituted glue could provide perhaps 50 calories, nearly useless by normal standards. But in Leningrad, those 50 calories might mean the difference between death today and survival until tomorrow. Then came an unexpected development. As December turned to January, as deaths peaked at 3,000 to 4,000 per day, Lake Ladoga began to freeze. The ice was treacherous, unstable, unable to bear significant weight, but it represented something German planners hadn't anticipated, a possible lifeline. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Siege of Leningrad. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the desperate survival methods used during those 900 days, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II's lesser-known stories of human endurance. Hit that subscribe button. These accounts take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Andrei Kovalenko wasn't supposed to survive. In normal circumstances, the 28-year-old Red Army sergeant would have been dead by January 1942. He'd lost 35 kilograms since September. His uniform hung on his frame like a scarecrow's clothes. His daily ration, when it came, consisted of 125 grams of sawdust bread and occasionally a thin soup made from what the commissary optimistically called meat substitute. But Kovalenko had discovered something that kept him functional when thousands around him collapsed: carpenter's glue. The technique came from his father, a furniture maker in Minsk. "My father used to make glue from animal bones," Kovalenko later wrote in his memoir. "We would boil bones for days until they broke down into this thick, gelatinous substance. I remembered that process. I realized that if my father could make glue from bones, I could reverse the process, extract calories from glue." The method was methodical. Kovalenko scavenged joiner's glue from abandoned woodworking shops and furniture factories. The glue came in hard, amber-colored blocks or granules, utterly inedible in its original form. But when broken into pieces and boiled for hours, it dissolved into a cloudy, viscous liquid. The smell was revolting, a mix of wet dog and industrial chemicals. The taste was worse. But Kovalenko forced it down, mixing the glue broth with hot water when he could heat it, choking it down cold when fuel for fire was unavailable. He wasn't alone. Across Leningrad, thousands of citizens discovered the same desperate solution. Valentina Bogdanova, a factory worker, described the process to historians decades later. "We called it kissel, a joke, because real kissel is a sweet fruit dessert. This was more like drinking dissolved rubber, but it filled your stomach. It gave you something, and in those days, something was everything." The human digestive system isn't designed to process pure collagen efficiently. Kovalenko and others who relied on glue soup suffered severe gastrointestinal distress, cramping, diarrhea, vomiting. But the alternative was starvation, and the body could extract minimal nutrition from the amino acids in the gelatin. Kovalenko rationed his glue carefully. 3 times daily, he consumed approximately 100 grams of reconstituted glue broth. Combined with his bread ration in occasional finds, pine needles boiled for vitamin C, birch bark soup, once a frozen potato discovered in a ruined building, he maintained a caloric intake of perhaps 600 to 700 calories per day. Not enough to thrive, barely enough to survive, but enough. His assignment with the 42nd Army kept him marginally more active than civilians. He worked as a supply coordinator, managing the warehouses near the Volkhov front. The job required him to stay on his feet, to think clearly despite the fog of hunger. The glue, he realized, was keeping his brain functional when malnutrition should have shut down cognitive function. While Kovalenko improvised his survival, something else was happening that would change the siege's trajectory. Lake Ladoga's ice had thickened. By late November, Soviet engineers determined the ice could support the weight of horses and light sleds. By December, the first trucks risked the crossing. The route quickly earned its name, Doroga Zizny, the Road of Life. It was a highway of ice, stretching 30 kilometers across Lake Ladoga, connecting Leningrad to Soviet-held territory on the eastern shore. The journey was nightmarish. Ice thickness varied dangerously. German artillery positioned on the southern shore fired constantly at the truck convoys. Luftwaffe bombers hunted vehicles during daylight hours. Hundreds of trucks broke through weak ice and plunged into the frozen lake, drivers drowning in darkness beneath the ice. But the road worked. On November 22nd, the first convoy of 60 trucks crossed safely, carrying 70 tons of flour. The next day, 100 trucks made the journey. By January, 300 trucks operated daily when weather permitted. The supplies were desperately inadequate. The city needed 1,000 tons of food daily, and the Road of Life managed barely 300 tons on the best days. But it was something. It was hope measured in grams. Kovalenko's role became critical. He coordinated the distribution of incoming supplies to military units along the Volkhov front. He watched as drivers arrived half frozen, some suffering severe frostbite, others experiencing the early stages of shock from the constant artillery fire. He logged every sack of flour, every case of canned goods, every precious kilogram that crossed the ice, and he continued drinking his glue soup, because his official rations alone wouldn't sustain him through the winter. January became February. February became March. The death toll peaked at 100,000 per month. Kovalenko's unit lost 15 men to starvation. The supply depot clerk, Mikhail Sokolov, died at his desk, his head slumped over inventory sheets. A radio operator, Katya Volkova, collapsed during her shift and never regained consciousness. Kovalenko survived. By March 1942, spring thaws made the Road of Life impassable to trucks, but by then, the worst had passed. Rations increased marginally. Shipments across Lake Ladoga continued via boats until the ice reformed the following winter. The city began to breathe again, barely, but enough. Medical officers conducting health assessments noted Kovalenko's condition with puzzlement. He should have been dead or critically ill. Instead, he remained functional. Emaciated, yes, but cogent, capable of performing his duties. When questioned about his survival, he explained his improvised diet. The medical officer, Captain Boris Stein, recorded the conversation in his log. Sergeant Kovalenko reports sustained consumption of joiner's glue reconstituted in boiling water, appears to have maintained minimal protein intake through this unorthodox source. Recommend further investigation of alternative food sources for survival analysis. The report went up the chain of command, eventually reaching Dmitry Pavlov's office. Pavlov read it with grim satisfaction. The city's citizens were improvising solutions military science hadn't conceived. They were surviving the unsurvivable. The siege would continue for another 2 years. But Leningrad would not break. Its defenders had learned to extract life from materials designed for carpentry. They had turned glue into sustenance, wallpaper into soup, leather into calories. Kovalenko's glue soup had become a survival strategy, quietly shared across the city. Never official, never sanctioned, but undeniably effective for those desperate enough to try it. After the winter of 1941-42, Soviet medical researchers began systematically studying Leningrad's survivors, trying to understand what allowed some citizens to endure while others perished. The findings challenged conventional nutritional science. Dr. Maria Fradkina at the Leningrad Institute of Nutritional Research documented dozens of cases like Kovalenko's. Her March 1942 report outlined the biochemistry of survival. Subjects consuming gelatin-based substances derived from industrial adhesives show marginally better protein retention than subjects relying solely on official rations. While gelatin proteins lack several essential amino acids, partial digestion provides glycine, proline, and hydroxyproline, amino acids that can be metabolized for energy and tissue maintenance. The science was grimly practical. Carpenter's glue, specifically traditional joiner's glue, manufactured from animal hides and bones, contained approximately 85% protein by weight. When reconstituted and boiled, the resulting broth provided absorbable collagen peptides, not efficient, not pleasant, but not entirely useless. Dr. Fradkina's team tested samples of various adhesives found throughout the city. Their findings were published in internal bulletins. Traditional animal-based glues maintain nutritional value. Modern synthetic adhesives are toxic and must be avoided. Citizens should verify glue composition before consumption. Look for older stocks dated before 1935, more likely to be animal-derived rather than chemical-based. The revelation carried dark implications. Leningrad citizens were conducting a citywide survival experiment, testing the absolute limits of human adaptation. They were consuming materials never intended for ingestion, materials that caused digestive trauma but provided just enough nutritional value to defer death by days or weeks. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans had badly miscalculated. Wehrmacht analysts examining intercepted Soviet communications in March 1942 expressed confusion at Leningrad's continued resistance. Prisoners of war captured from the Leningrad front described survival techniques that sounded impossible: leather soup, pine needle tea, glue broth. German medical officers initially dismissed these reports as exaggerations. Then captured Soviet survival bulletins proved they were true. The city had become a laboratory of extreme deprivation, and its citizens were adapting with shocking resourcefulness. Most critically, the psychological impact of these adaptations extended beyond mere caloric intake. The act of improvising, of actively seeking solutions rather than passively accepting starvation, gave survivors a sense of agency. Kovalenko later reflected, "The glue kept me alive physically, but the knowledge that I had found a way to fight back, that kept me alive mentally. We weren't just waiting to die. We were problem solving. Every day we survived was a victory." Soviet propaganda carefully avoided publicizing the grimmer survival methods. Public acknowledgement would have damaged morale and provided the Germans with psychological warfare ammunition. But internally, military authorities began incorporating these lessons into siege warfare doctrine. Stavka, the Soviet High Command, commissioned studies on minimum survival requirements for besieged populations. The Leningrad experience demonstrated that humans could endure far longer on far less than previously calculated, provided they had access to unconventional nutritional sources, and maintained psychological resilience. The broader strategic impact was significant. German plans had assumed Leningrad would capitulate within months. Instead, the city absorbed Wehrmacht resources, men, artillery, ammunition, that could have been deployed elsewhere. The siege tied down Army Group North for 872 days, preventing those forces from reinforcing the fighting at Moscow or Stalingrad. Field Marshal Georgy Zhukov later wrote, "Leningrad's resistance changed our understanding of urban defense. A city that refuses to surrender, even when surrounded and starving, becomes an unbreakable fortress. The defenders don't need abundant supplies. They need just enough to survive one more day, and the will to improvise when official provisions fail." The revelation was clear. Human endurance exceeded all predictions when survival depended on it. And sometimes, survival tasted like carpenter's glue. Andrei Kovalenko survived the siege. On January 27, 1944, when Soviet forces finally broke the German encirclement after 872 days, he weighed 48 kilograms, barely half his pre-war weight. His digestive system bore permanent damage from years of consuming materials never meant for human consumption. He suffered chronic gastric problems for the rest of his life, but he was alive. Kovalenko received no medals for drinking glue soup. The Soviet state preferred to celebrate conventional heroism: soldiers who charged German positions, pilots who shot down Luftwaffe bombers, workers who maintained tank production under artillery fire. Survival through improvisation, while necessary, wasn't the narrative the state wanted to promote. Yet in the decades after the war, Kovalenko's story, and thousands like it, became central to understanding Leningrad's resistance. He participated in multiple historical interviews in the 1960s and 1970s, his accounts preserved in the archives of the Museum of the Defense of Leningrad. He died in 1981 at age 67, outliving many who never experienced the siege. The final death toll of the Siege of Leningrad remains disputed. Soviet official figures listed 632,000 deaths. Modern historians estimate between 800,000 and 1.5 million fatalities, with approximately 97% dying from starvation and related diseases rather than combat. It stands as the deadliest siege in human history, exceeding even the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in total civilian casualties. The siege's lessons became part of Soviet military doctrine. Training manuals incorporated siege survival techniques, though delicately phrased. Besieged populations should identify all possible nutritional sources within defensive perimeters, was the euphemistic language for "eat whatever won't kill you." The psychological resilience demonstrated by Leningrad citizens became a cornerstone of Soviet identity. The city received the title Hero City in 1945, one of only 12 Soviet cities so honored. The Siege of Leningrad represented the ultimate test of Soviet resolve, a population that endured the unsurvivable and emerged victorious. Modern nutritional science has validated what Leningrad survivors discovered through desperation. Research into extreme starvation scenarios, including studies of concentration camp survivors and famine victims, confirms that partial protein sources like gelatin can provide minimal but significant nutritional benefit when nothing else is available. The human body's ability to extract value from suboptimal nutrition sources is remarkable when survival depends on it. Perhaps most significantly, the siege demonstrated the limits of starvation as a military weapon. The Wehrmacht strategy, starve them into submission, failed catastrophically. Far from breaking morale, the siege hardened resistance. Every civilian who survived another day by eating wallpaper paste or boiling leather belts was an act of defiance against German strategy. Historians studying urban warfare and siege tactics now use Leningrad as the benchmark for human endurance. Military planners worldwide acknowledge that civilian populations, when sufficiently motivated and resourceful, can survive far longer than logistics models predict. The siege ended on January 27, 1944, but its legacy persists. Every year, survivors and their descendants gather at Leningrad's, now St. Petersburg's, Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, where 500,000 victims of the siege are buried in mass graves. They remember not just the deaths, but the desperate ingenuity that allowed hundreds of thousands to survive. The Siege of Leningrad teaches a lesson that extends far beyond military history. The difference between surrender and survival often comes down to willingness to adapt beyond all acceptable limits. Andrei Kovalenko didn't survive because he was stronger or luckier than those who perished. He survived because he was willing to do what survival required, no matter how unthinkable. There's no glory in drinking carpenter's glue, no heroism in scraping wallpaper paste from walls and boiling it into soup. These aren't the acts we celebrate in monuments or memorialize in statues, but they represent something profoundly human: the refusal to accept death when even the smallest possibility of life remains. Military strategists plan for logistics, for supply lines, for the calculated mathematics of siege warfare. They account for food reserves, caloric requirements, the timeline from hunger to collapse. But they consistently underestimate one variable: human ingenuity born of absolute desperation. Leningrad's defenders didn't triumph through superior firepower or brilliant tactics. They won by being willing to consume glue, to redefine what constituted food, to survive one impossible day after another, until those days accumulated into 872. 900 days, one desperate adaptation at a time, one mouthful of wallpaper paste, one spoonful of boiled leather, one cup of glue broth that tasted like hell but meant one more tomorrow. Sometimes the most important victories are measured not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in days survived. And sometimes survival requires eating things that were never meant to be eaten. If you found this story as haunting and inspiring, as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered. Stories of ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances. I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.